Hello. Thank you for joining this webinar. Of course, we all hope that this is one of the last of these online events and we'll be able to meet in person very soon now that lockdown restrictions are being lifted. But for the moment, as I say, welcome to this webinar. My name is David Smith, economics editor of the Sunday Times. I also write a column for the Times during the week, and I also write for Property Notify, which I hope you read and use as well. So anyway, welcome to this. What I wanted to do today is talk about the economy and the housing market. I'll start by talking about the economy and, in particular, things which I think are important to the housing market: the pace of the recovery that we're going to see, interest rates, obviously very important, and unemployment, also very important. Then I'll talk about the housing market in general and the strength of the housing market, and then I'll have a little bit to say about renting and landlords. So if I could start by talking about the economy in general. One thing I think it's important to think about, obviously, it can be confusing, the flurry of information you get about the economy in the papers. Is it recovering? Is it going to have a setback? Is the easing of restrictions going to be delayed? And so on. That it's quite a straightforward story in terms of the economy and the recovery. So essentially, what we're seeing in this cycle of recession and recovery is one that's quite unusual in the sense that it has almost been completely determined by the level of government restrictions. And we saw that very clearly a year ago in March to May 2020. We'd never had a lockdown before in peacetime, and probably not in wartime either, in the UK. When that was announced on March the 23rd last year, people didn't know how long it was going to last, and they didn't know how to respond to it. And of course, what we saw then was a huge negative effect on the economy as things were shut down. And it's important to remember that in that period, things were shut down that weren't subsequently shut down in the later lockdowns. So, for example, the housing market was closed down from March to May 2020 in that first lockdown. Other things stopped operating. A lot of factories stopped operating. A lot of construction sites stopped operating, even though they were not required to do so, because the employers, the firms concerned, wanted to introduce safety procedures. So a big negative effect. If I can put that in perspective, a very bad quarter for the economy in terms of falling GDP, gross domestic product, would be if it fell by 2 or 3% in a quarter. I think the worst we'd had before this pandemic was in the 3-day week in early 1974, when the economy shrank by nearly 3% in a single quarter. During the financial crisis, and you remember how serious we thought that recession was, the worst quarterly falls were about 2%. And if I tell you that in that first lockdown, the result was a near 20% fall in GDP in the second quarter of last year, then you get an idea about how big the impact was of essentially switching the economy off. And most of the story about what's been happening since has been recovering from that low point. The low point was reached in April 2020. By October, we'd got quite a lot of it back. Then we went into the November lockdown, and that only provided a brief respite before we went into the lockdown earlier this year, from which we are now emerging. Big lesson about the second and third lockdowns is that they had a much less serious effect than the first. So in both November and in January, we saw the economy contract, but probably by only about a tenth of what happened in the first lockdown. Two reasons for that. One is that not as much was closed, including the housing market. Second reason was that People had adapted and businesses adapted to living with lockdown. So it doesn't mean lockdowns are a good thing, but we'd learned to adapt, if you like, to living with them. So that recovery story got quite a long way by October, big bounce over the summer and into the early autumn. Then it was stalled briefly by the November lockdown, bit of a recovery in December. January was bad, and you think back, things were pretty grim there. But February and March have seen things pick up again, and there will be, obviously, when we get the figures, there would have been a much bigger pickup in economic activity in April and May. And that speaks to two other things I wanted to talk about on the economy. One is how worried should we be that this bounce back, this release of pent up demand, is going to give us an inflation shock and is going to give us a lot more inflation, and that the Bank of England will have to respond to that by raising interest rates. Interest rates at the moment, official interest rates, bank rate, just 0.1%, has never been lower in the Bank of England's history, which is a history that stretches back more than 300 years. Is it going to respond to this rise in inflation, which we're already seeing to an extent? Big increases in energy prices, in raw material prices. The latest figures we have show that the inflation rate doubled. It doubled only to quite a low level still of 1.5%, but is picking up for people who prefer the RPI, the Retail Prices Index. That's at nearly 3% now. But the answer to whether the Bank of England is going to respond to that with higher interest rates is, from me at least, a definite no, or at least not for quite a long while. The bank is going to hold its fire on interest rates, as in the period after the financial crisis. It wants to give the recovery time to breathe, time to pick up. It will see most of the increase in inflation that we're witnessing at the moment as temporary, or as some people prefer to call it, transitory, because we're moving from a period of severe restrictions into a much more freer environment, but also because a lot of the inflation, the measured inflation at the moment, is the result of things being very depressed. A year ago, energy prices were very low, or the oil price fell to very low levels. Petrol prices fell to low levels. They're up about 20% from where they were a year ago. But that is, that is partly because they were so depressed in 2020. So some of that will wash out over time, and I think the Bank of England will bide its time before doing anything on interest rates as a result. I mean, I talk to Bank of England people a lot, and I get no sense that they're even, their trigger finger is even itching very slightly in terms of raising interest rates. They're pretty comfortable with the level of interest rates as they are at the moment. So I think we can relax about that, and that's I think that's good news for people involved in property, people involved in the housing market. There isn't going to be the kind of things that we used to have, sudden shock interest rate increases, which can knock everything back. Second reason for optimism, I'd say, related to this growth story, is to do with unemployment. For quite a long time now, one of the fears stalking the housing market, and you see it in quite a lot of the predictions for house prices at the start of the year, was that what was going to happen when the furlough scheme came to an end. Furlough scheme and its self-employment equivalent, but particularly the furlough scheme, we've never seen anything like that before. Government paying 80% of people's wages. 11.5 million people have been covered by the furlough scheme at various times. The number's well down now, but it provided big support to the job market and prevented an increase in unemployment. Has prevented an increase in unemployment during the period it's been operating. But the fear was that once it wound down, and it's due to wind down in September, then that would create a cliff edge, and the result of that would be much higher unemployment, which would again have a dampening effect on the housing market. Now, those fears have started to subside. Unemployment, measured unemployment, has in fact been coming down slightly rather than going up. It's now back below 5%, 4.8%, very low level, given the severity of the drop in the shrinkage of the economy last year. And at one time, people said, well, that's all very well, but what about all these people who are furloughed? When they come onto the job market, we're going to see a lot more unemployment. That is no longer the big fear, I think. What we've seen recently is every survey, every employment survey points to pretty strong increase in demand for workers. Employment intentions are very strong, and also vacancies are going up, and vacancies are going up very sharply, which means that a lot of people who are still on furlough will find their way back to working for the employer who's got them on furlough at the moment. So most of them will do that, but others who are let go, I think, will have much less of a problem finding a job than was feared even a few months ago. So the various extensions of the furlough scheme, which, as you may recall, was due to be wound down over last winter, but was extended because of the further lockdowns. I think the fallout from this, I would say, when the furlough scheme stops, it is likely to give us a little bit more unemployment, but not very much. And that is because we're talking about a strongly recovering economy now, and jobs will be created in that strongly recovering economy. So I don't think we have to worry too much about interest rates. I don't think we have to worry too much about a big unemployment shock. And just to put some of the numbers for the economy into perspective, last year was, on official figures, the economy shrank by nearly 10%, 9.8%, with pretty much all of that concentrated in the spring during that first lockdown, when we had the precipitous fall in the second quarter. A 9.8% fall was the worst since 1709, the Great Frost, the year of the Great Frost, when people could skate on the River Thames. If we grow in line with expectations this year, we won't get all of that back, but a reasonable projection is that the economy grows by 7 or 8% this year, and that will be the strongest we've seen in terms of a kind of trampoline bounce for the economy since 1941, or if you prefer a peacetime comparison, either 1927 or even 1870. So we're talking about historic numbers here, big swing down followed by a big recovery. And the recovery phase, as I say, is generating jobs, and because it is generating some inflation as well, but not enough to worry the Bank of England unduly. Now, what about the housing market? How is the housing market doing in this context? And the answer at the moment is that it is roaring away. If you look at all the statistics for the housing market, whether it be prices, transactions, mortgage approvals, or whichever you care to look at, they are all very strong. The official house price index has just ticked above 10%, 10% double figure rise in house prices compared with a year ago. Now, again, some of that is due to the fact that prices were depressed during that first lockdown, so there's an effect there. And if you remember back to the spring of 2020, there were a lot of fears back then, not only that we were going to see a huge rise in unemployment, but that we were going to see a big fall in house prices. That didn't happen. As soon as the market reopened in May last year, it reopened in a position of strength. While people were at home, they spent their time looking at property websites. The lockdown and the experience of working from home made people think differently about the kind of place they wanted to live and where they wanted to live. And there was no diminution of interest. In fact, there was an increase in interest in housing, and so the market is very strong. And for the first, we're seeing a kind of subtle shift happening now. For the first few months of this perhaps unexpectedly strong housing market in the light of the pandemic, what you saw was that the demand was strong. That any survey you care to look at, say the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, the RICS survey, new buyer inquiries, the number of people getting in touch with estate agents and surveyors saying they're interested in buying a property, that those are very strong. But also supply was pretty strong for a few months last year, and you can understand why that is. You can understand people at home looking at the property websites, want to buy somewhere, want to buy something somewhere differently, but also some of the people selling and putting their properties on the market were doing so in the expectation that they too wanted to move somewhere. It takes two to tango in the housing market, as you know. So people who had been living in a place which was handy for commuting 5 days a week, maybe they wanted to move as well. So they put their properties on the market. So the two things came together. Demand was strong, supply was strong, mortgage availability was good, so mortgage approvals were also strong, transactions picked up, and not all of that pickup in transactions was just a catch up from the market was closed. So firing on most cylinders. The subtle change I was going to talk about was that just in the last few weeks, and we'll see what happens in this. The demand has continued strong in the housing market. So all those measures, like new buyer inquiries in the RICS survey, have continued at very elevated levels. Interest in the housing market, interest in buying is still very strong, but supply has started to tail off a little bit. So there is more reluctance on the part of sellers. Estate agents report a shortage of stock on their books, which they weren't doing a few months ago, and that is that has become a factor. Now, it may be one of the luckiest things that one can think of in terms of the housing market was the decision by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, to extend the stamp duty cut in his early March budget. Now, when he first announced that cut back in July last year, his motivation was to prevent the kind of fall in house prices and housing activity that people feared at that time. There had been a big drop in transactions, but also he wanted to ensure that the builders, the house builders, kept sites open. They didn't shut down because they feared that there wouldn't be any demand for new properties. So the stamp duty cut back then in July last year was aimed at shoring up the market, ensuring that demand continued strong, reducing the cost of transactions. The surprise was that, and you could see the argument for it in lots of information that we had on the housing market at that time in the summer of last year. Transactions were down, buyers were at that stage a little bit tentative, and fears of unemployment were all around. Now that wasn't really the case in March. So I think the justification for extending the stamp duty cut, the exemption up to 500,000 in the March budget was much less than it was in July. There was no obvious need for it apart from avoiding a cliff edge and allowing people whose transactions were in the process of being completed but hadn't been completed to complete. So a full extension till the end of June, partial extension till the end of September. Quite a generous tax cut for the industry, for the market, which, as I say, was a gift from the Chancellor, which many didn't expect, and that has provided an additional boost to house prices and activity. Now, one of the questions that people sometimes ask, as I said earlier, that one of the fears was that a rise in unemployment would hit the market. The other was what happens when the stamp duty cut comes to an end, and as I say, it comes to an end in full at the end of June, and then it is available only in a partial way until the end of September. Again, I think it would be wrong to fear too much from that, and that is because the economy I would fully expect to be pretty strong through the summer and into the autumn. And one thing, the thing, house prices do not fall, and housing activity does not fall spontaneously. It is a reflection of what is happening in the wider economy. If the wider economy is strong and doing well and recovering well, then that itself provides support for the housing market, even if the tax cut will be taken away. And I think it will be taken away this time. I did think, and I did write that there was a likelihood of the stamp duty cut being extended in the March budget, even though the case for it was much weaker than last year. But I think fears that this is going to pull away an important prop for the housing market are overdone. I would expect, the market is roaring away at the moment. I'd expect when the stamp duty cut comes to an end, it will proceed at a more gentle pace. But I don't see a significant reversal. So things look pretty good as far as I can see. The economy is going to do well, recovering from the pandemic as restrictions are lifted. But I also think that provides support for the housing market, even as the stamp duty cut comes to an end. Let me just say something briefly about landlords and renting. The first thing I think is that one thing we've seen is that 2020 was obviously an unusual year in the sense that everything was different, and we were all living with an uncertainty that we hadn't seen before. But I think it was also a year as far as landlords are concerned, when the great sell-off, which resulted from, in particular, George Osborne's tax changes, which you will be all very familiar with, and many of you still quite angry about. I think the sell-off prompted by those changes, treatment of mortgage interest, refurbishment post a tenancy, and so on. When those the sell-off triggered by those changes, which, as I say, were very unwelcome for a lot of people in the industry, I think that had subsided, and I think 2020 marked a time when that process had largely gone through. So if you look at the full year figures, we saw that the process of reducing portfolios, reducing rental properties by landlords, it didn't come completely to an end, but the balance of sales was very different. In balance of sales versus acquisitions by landlords was different in 2020 than it had been for the previous 2 or 3 years, when the sell-off was occurring. So I think there was a change there. In terms of the rental market in general, people will have their own measures of what to look at here. The surveys I look at tell a fairly uniform picture, which is that the London rental market is still pretty depressed, and that relates to all these things that have been set in train by the pandemic. Much less commuting into central London. I've travelled up a few times recently and have been surprised by how quiet it still is. Even on a rush hour train, it's a fraction of what it would have been in pre-pandemic times. So, and that has carried with it, the fact that people maybe no longer feel they have to live either in central London or in the inner suburbs, or even in the outer suburbs. So, if you are adapting to a 2 days in the office, 3 days at home, then the commute can be longer, and people don't need to be in central London or close to their place of work if they're going there less frequently. We know all this, and the contrast is with most of the rest of the country, where rental demand is pretty strong, supply is quite weak and quite limited, perhaps because of the results of that multi-year sell-off of properties because of the change in tax treatment that I was referring to before. So, demand in most parts of the country for rental properties exceeds supply. Rents are going up at a reasonably healthy rate in everywhere apart from London, and I would have thought that would continue, because I think the demand for properties as people change their living patterns is partly in the sales market, but also partly in the rental market. And I think these changes are probably going to be quite long lasting. When we were first hit by the pandemic, my initial thought was that we would go back to normal, and normal would be more or less where it was before the pandemic. But now I think it's reasonable to say that things will be different, and everybody seems to be moving towards this hybrid model of part working from home, part working in an office, and that will have important long-term effects on the market. I think London will come back. London is still going to be an international city. It's still going to be a place that people want to live in, and of course there may be more residential properties available if offices aren't being used as much. There will be more conversions and so on. But for the moment, I think the adjustment is still occurring in London, I think, and has a little bit further to go. But as I say, rental market in the rest of the country looks pretty good to me. That's essentially what I wanted to say today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've stayed with it. I'm sorry I'm not with you to be able to answer any questions, because I know from previous experience that the questions at these events are always to the point and tough. But as I say, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you very much indeed.